Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Priya Natarajan, the current director of the Frankie program. I'm an astrophysicist and I'm a faculty member in the departments of physics and astronomy at Yale. I am deeply invested in interdisciplinary scholarship, as you probably guessed. And thanks to my academic training in sort of an intellectual interest in the history and philosophy of science. I'm very fortunate to be leading the Frankie program, which is the flagship cross-disciplinary program at Yale. First, I would like to start by recognizing the generosity and support of our benefactors, Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Barbara Franke, for all they do for us and for Yale. I'm delighted that they're going to be joining us today. First, I would also like to remind you that we are recording this event and that all participants must therefore mute their videos. If you wish, you can submit your questions after the talk through the chat feature. Our speaker this evening is one of our own brilliant scholars, Professor Alan Mikhail, Professor of History and the current chair of the Department of History at Yale. Alan is a preeminent historian of the early modern Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire, and Egypt. His research and teaching focuses mostly on the history of empires and environments, both matters that are incredibly important to understand beyond the confines of academia, as we all venture to make sense of today's complex, globally interconnected, and yet fractured world, rife with inequities of opportunity, health, and wealth, and the looming climate catastrophe wrought by uncurtailed human activities over history and their damaging impact on the environment. He received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, where his dissertation won the Malcolm Kerr Award of the Middle East Studies Association and Berkeley's own James Kettner Award. He was a member of the Andrew Mellon Fellowship of Scholars in the Humanities and was at Stanford University before coming to Yale in 2010. He's the author of many acclaimed books, the first of which, The Animal in Ottoman Egypt, came out in 2014, Nature and Empire in Ottoman Egypt, and Environmental History, that came out in 2011. He's also the editor of Water on Sand, Environmental Histories of the Middle East and North Africa. So his research articles have appeared in all the eminent journals across disciplines, and he's the recipient of many awards and honors. And in interest of time, I will just mention a few: the Roger Owen Award of the Middle East Studies Association, the Alice Hamilton Prize of the American Society for Environmental History, the Wayne Rasmussen Prize of the Agricultural History Society, and the Yale's Gustav Ranis and Samuel and Ronnie Heyman Prizes. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in the history of the early modern Muslim world and the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire, and environmental history. So before I hand over to him, I just wanted to remind you of a few upcoming Frankie program events. We have the author and science communicator, Anissa Ramirez, former Yale faculty member, giving a talk on April 20th at 4 p.m. And we have the Inference Project Colloquium by the philosopher Lorenzo Mangani on April 22nd. And then we have Linda Lynn Haupt, the author of Mozart's Starling, who will be speaking to us on April 27th. So we have a full roster for April. And we also are planning to show the movie Coded Bias and have a discussion with the filmmaker on April 21st. And so I would also like to remind you all to look at our two other ongoing projects, the Learning by Doing project on our website and the Inference, Understanding the Nature of Inference project. So now to today's event. Today, Alan will be talking to us about his new book, God's Shadow, Sultan Selim, His Ottoman Empire, and the Making of the Modern World. And the title of his talk is Columbus and Islam. And this is an encounter that I'm extremely excited and curious to hear about. Thank you so much, Alan, for agreeing to speak to us today.
Thank you, Priya, very much for having me. I want to begin by extending my thanks to you for the invitation, to Ty and to Guy for helping to organize today's event. Thanks to everybody for tuning in on this afternoon in March. I wish we could do it in person, but one day soon. I'm going to go ahead and begin by sharing my screen. And as I do that, of course, allow me also to thank the Frankie family for this lecture series and for all of their support of what we do at Yale. As Priya said, this talk is coming out of a book that I just published that's really focused on the life of a particular Ottoman Sultan, Selim I, the 9th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, who lived from 1470 to 1520. I'm really not going to be talking much about him today. I'm going to be focusing in on a part of the book that addresses part of the role of the Ottoman Empire and of other Muslim polities around the Mediterranean in the shaping of Columbus. This is something that I go in depth into in the book. So if you're curious about how this story fits into a larger story about the Ottoman Empire and the early modern world, I'd encourage you to take a look at the book. So two narratives dominate the story of the conjoining of the continents of the Old World and the Americas: peopling and depeopling. That is conquest and genocide, nation building and colonization, the migration of Europeans and the forced movement of enslaved Africans on the one hand, and the displacement and death of millions of indigenous Americans on the other. These are obviously very familiar narratives that work quite well. Much of the arc of the story that they tell is useful for us in thinking about the history of the Atlantic world, and much of it does a lot of very good work for our understanding of how we came to be in this historical moment. As with any historical framework, though, these grand narratives also miss some things as well. So in my talk today, I want to argue for another grand narrative, one that I think needs to be a part of the violent story of the joining of the 4 Atlantic continents. And that is the role of the confrontation between Islam and Christendom in the shaping of this history. It's an essential part of the story I'll try to show today. It's an essential part of the story of the colonization of the Americas, the extension of Europe and Africa across the ocean, and it's essential that it be a part of our understanding of this history. Conflict and cooperation between Islam and Christianity shaped the history of the Mediterranean, perhaps more than any other single force. And this was as true before 1492 as it was after, some of which is gestured to in the quote that's on the screen. The Europeans who went to the Americas were in many ways formed by this geopolitical encounter, and as I'll discuss, it remained a salient feature of their world, even on the other side of the ocean. Indeed, one could tell a continuous story of the role of Islam in the shaping of the history of the Americas from 1492 to the present. This is a story that involves slavery, piracy, trade, the captivity of Europeans in the Muslim world, immigration, warfare, cultural exchange, and assimilation. I won't be able to tell that full story here today. Rather, I'm focusing, obviously, on the very first moment of this history, the one that has rightly been freighted with so much explanatory weight in the narratives I mentioned above, Columbus and 1492. I will ask how Islam shaped Columbus and his voyages and what its role was in the very early years of the European colonization of the Caribbean. This will be the bulk of my talk today, and at the end, I'll offer thoughts about some of the implications of the story that I'm telling about Columbus and Islam. So let me begin the story then where Columbus began, and that is in the city of Genoa. He was born there in 1451, and even in the small neighborhood he shared with his parents and 4 siblings, Islam was a presence. Columbus spent most of the first 2 decades of his life in that neighborhood. He would have seen or heard about the many fleets leaving for Jerusalem on one of the numerous crusades that originated in Genoa. Columbus's city was a magnet for crusaders owing to the strong presence of the Knights of St. John, who offered free housing and medical care to crusaders. Columbus and his family likely knew some crusaders, and he no doubt grew up hearing of their tales of distant lands and infidel enemies. It's important that Columbus was born just 2 years before the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror took the city of Constantinople. This is the Bellini portrait of Mehmet. More than any other event, this conquest shaped the contours of Columbus's and indeed his entire generation's geopolitical life. Constant calls for European crusades against the Ottomans didn't lead to very much in the second half of the 15th century. Columbus's age was mostly one of European stasis in the face of Muslim ascendancy. In Genoa's San Lorenzo Cathedral, Columbus went to Mass every week. This church held important treasures supposedly captured during earlier crusades. An emerald green bowl said to be the dish Jesus washed his hands in before the Last Supper, and a silver reliquary purported to contain the ashes of John the Baptist. Such trophies of conquest were sprinkled all over Europe, from the smallest towns to the largest cathedrals. They brought the conflict between Islam and Christianity into nearly every European neighborhood church, amulets of the looming threat of Islam that had supposedly been captured during earlier crusades. In between Sundays at San Lorenzo, Columbus would have learned about other Europeans who had traveled to the Muslim world. Even though it was a vital crusader entrepot, Genoa was above all a mercantile port, not a military one. Over the centuries, the Genoese merchant families who ran the city developed many distant connections. Colonies of Genoese merchants prospered in cities like Beirut, Alexandria, Tunis, Oran, Algiers, in Europe in places like Naples, Paris, London, and so on. Sometimes these Genoese trading families even exercised something akin to political control in some of these cities, especially around the Black Sea coast. Genoa maintained very old connections to ports and towns that would steadily be incorporated into the Ottoman Empire in the 14th and the 15th centuries. In Columbus's youth, Genoa's merchant community was growing indeed quite anxious about Ottoman advances in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and already mourning some of their losses around the two seas. In addition,
Alan?
Yes.
I had a very quick question. So was Genoa actually a very wealthy city at this point? Or, I mean, so what was the socioeconomic frame at this time?
Sure. Genoa is indeed quite a wealthy city, largely based on its trading connections with the East. Absolutely. And you get a sense from this map of the expanse of their trading connections. So in addition to breathing in the mercantile air all around him in Genoa, Columbus learned important lessons about the East by reading the works of various writers, and in particular the work of one other Italian who had spent time in some of Genoa's Black Sea cities, and that's Marco Polo. Reading the famous tales of Marco Polo, and again, other accounts of travels to distant lands, helped to form Columbus's mental canvas as a boy. One of the most important things Columbus learned from Marco Polo was the existence of a figure known as the Grand Khan of the East. Marco supposedly arrived in the opulent court of this Grand Khan, far off in some vague place in Asia, past Constantinople, Jerusalem, Baghdad, and Afghanistan, where he writes that he discovered a jewel-encrusted paradise of luxury, learning, and power. What most interested Columbus and other European readers of Marco Polo was that the Grand Khan was precisely not a Christian, but according to Marco Polo, wanted to be one. Although he had achieved the heights of civilization without the benefits of Christianity, the Grand Khan seemed to understand the truth of the religion and might even convert himself, thereby gaining for Christianity the souls of all his subjects. This fantasy of the Grand Khan and his potential conversion lit European imaginations. For Christians, he offered the perfect mirror of everything Islam should have been but wasn't. A civilization, no doubt, one formed outside of the realm of Christianity, but one that also recognized its own bankruptcy in the face of the glories of Christianity. The Grand Khan was thus not yet a Christian, but according to the fantasy was always about to be one. Moreover, once he entered the faith, the Muslims of the Middle East, in possession of Jerusalem, the object of the Crusades, would then be surrounded by Christians who in one final apocalyptic pincer move would destroy Islam forever to retake the Holy City. So after centuries of crusades, with the spectacular growth of the Ottoman and Mamluk empires, increasingly blocking access to trade with the East, Europe looked with anticipation to a potentate thousands of miles away. Filled with these and other fantasies, raised on accounts of the Crusades, Columbus's interactions with Islam deepened during his teenage years when he began taking to the Mediterranean as an apprentice sailor, embarking on his first maritime voyages at the age of 13 or 14. He worked as a merchant's assistant, packing merchandise on board ships, recording weights and costs, securing lodging in ports for captain and crew, and generally being available to help with navigation and business matters. He built a reputation for himself as a reliable and efficient sailor for hire, and was able to find endless opportunities working the sea for merchant and other expeditions in the employ of Europe's many small principalities and larger polities. Some of these voyages in his early years sailing around the Mediterranean took him to the shores of both the Ottoman Empire and to other Muslim states around the sea. So the map that I'm now showing you is one that we're quite accustomed to seeing about Columbus's sailing career before the 4 voyages, that he was plying off the course of Portugal, made his way down to West Africa, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the section that I'm about to share with you is really even before this. It's to make the point that he had a Mediterranean sailing career before ever crossing through the Strait of Gibraltar, and that this is an important part of understanding Columbus and his biography, but really crucial for understanding his connections with the Muslim world. So I don't have a map of his Mediterranean voyages, but the map that I'm showing you now has a pre-map that I'm going to give to you now in words. So in 1472, when Columbus was 21, we have an account of his first direct encounter with the Muslim world, the first one that we know. He took a job as a mercenary sailor for the King of Anjou during a war to capture Naples. Over the course of this fighting, one of the king's large 3-masted ships was captured and commandeered to Tunis in North Africa. The king dispatched Columbus to sail to North Africa to bring his ship back. Tunis in those years was the stronghold of the Hafsid Empire, an empire that ruled along much of the coast of North Africa, that made much of its money from piracy and also from the overland caravan trade along the coast and then also along the Sahara. Like other city-states around the Mediterranean, whether in Italy or other parts of North Africa, the Hafsid Empire made a lot of money and was able to put that money towards great art, culture, and patronage. Intrepid youth that he was, Columbus, charged with retrieving the king's ship, sailed excitedly, he tells us, with his more apprehensive crew from Naples, first to Sardinia to rest and resupply, and then turn south to North Africa to attempt to retrieve the ship. We don't know the outcome of this venture. We don't know if the ship was retrieved or not. Columbus doesn't mention that he retrieved the ship. One might presume that if he had, he would have mentioned it. Despite the uncertainties, though, in the historical record, this earliest encounter of Columbus with the world of Islam was his first opportunity to test the stories that he had heard about in his youth, about crusades, the stories he heard at church from reading Marco Polo, his first opportunity to test these stories against the reality of the awesome power of a Muslim state, in this case, the Hafsid Empire. He experienced firsthand the naval power of the rulers of Tunis to capture and hold the king's ship. His account that he writes after the fact describes the fear that he saw in his crew's eyes when they realized they would have to sail south into enemy territory, presumably outmatched and outmanned. Sailing to Tunis in his early 20s thus was an opportunity to test the mythologies of his youth against the power of Muslim states around the Mediterranean. He would gain closer and much more profound firsthand experience of the Muslim world a couple years later, when in 1475, a family firm in Genoa, the Spinolas, sent him to Chios, the hilly island of mostly scrub vegetation in the Aegean Sea, just off the Anatolian shore. Chios, famous for its mastic. This is the mastic tree, and then the mastic sap that was used in cooking and medicines of all kinds. Genoa lost its colony in Crimea in the northern Black Sea, its last outpost on the Black Sea, in 1475, just a few months, in fact, before Columbus went to Chios that year. So Chios, when Columbus arrived there, represented Genoa's easternmost territory and in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and was therefore of vital commercial and strategic interests. This is a rendition of the port of Chios. In traveling to Chios, Columbus was exposed for the very first time to the awesome power of the Ottoman Empire. Although the island was still a Genoese colony, it was very much in the Ottomans' orbit. They ruled the blue seas around the island and all the ports of call on the coast just across the narrow straits that separated the island from mainland Anatolia. The Ottomans had captured other major Aegean islands over the previous 2 decades, places like Imbros, Limnos, Lesvos, Samothrace. And Columbus was regaled when in Chios with tales of dread and horror about the Ottoman conquest of Keffa in Crimea, again, just a few months before he arrived there, and even more so of the conquest of Constantinople almost 2 decades earlier. The memory of the loss of Constantinople in particular was very fresh on the island of Chios, even over 20 years later. The Genoese sent many reinforcements from Chios, the closest of the Italian state's outposts to Constantinople. And this contingent suffered heavy losses that affected almost every family on Chios. So the stories Columbus learned in his youth of Christianity's crusades with Islam were suddenly brought to life for him when he met and heard from the relatives of others who had actually fought against the awesome power of the Ottomans in their conquest of Constantinople. Here on the eastern front of Christendom, he witnessed the awesome power of the Ottoman Empire. He saw that it surrounded a tiny island like Chios, that it might very well continue its march west, perhaps even into Europe itself. Like other islands, the majority of Chios was Greek, but there was a growing Turkish population there as well. Columbus heard on the island about Constantinople and other losses around the Black Sea and in the Aegean, bringing home to him again the idea that Christianity had to be boldly offensive against Islam or risk further losses to the Ottomans and other Muslim powers. After his time in the employ of the Spinolas and his time in Chios, Columbus eventually makes his way to Portugal. There, he fell in with the group of explorers that the famous Portuguese Prince Henry the Navigator had assembled before his death. Like many ambitious Europeans, these Portuguese adventurers were looking for ways around the Muslim world. They also believed in the truth of crusade. Like Columbus, they had heard tales of the Grand Khan of the East and were interested in trying to find a path towards the Grand Khan. They were indeed quite explicit in defining many of their expeditions in religious terms as part of a global crusade between Christendom and Islam. For example, according to one of Henry's contemporaries, writing in that fateful year 1453, Henry, quote, was actuated by the zeal for God, by the desire for alliance with the Eastern Christians of the Grand Khan, by an eagerness to know how far the power of the infidel existed, by the wish to convert people to Christianity, and by the desire to fight the Moors. Henry's most famous plan to outflank the Muslims of the Mediterranean rested on his belief in a southern route around Africa. And he and his explorers spent much of their time flying around along the West African coast. It was to their utter terror and dismay when working their way south along the African coast, they discovered that Islam was already flourishing in many parts of West Africa. By the time the Portuguese arrived, Islam had grown from a minority faith of a few adherents to the official state religion of several West African empires, most prominent among them the Mali Empire, that had adopted Islam as its official religion in 1324. In the 15th century, when these Portuguese explorers were sailing along the coast, the presence of Muslims in West Africa further deepened the sense among European Christian crusaders that their faith was somehow surrounded by Islam and that some drastic action was needed to attempt to defend against this further spread. As they continued sailing south along the African coast, the farthest point they reached was the port city of São Jorge de Mina, what is known today as El Mina in Ghana. This city would prove a linchpin of Portugal's empire in West Africa, a key conduit for funneling first gold and later slaves from West Africa to Portugal and then eventually elsewhere as well. In 1481, Portugal's new king, João II, resolved that his kingdom needed a stronger presence on the Gulf of Guinea to protect its growing economic stakes in the gold trade. And so he dispatched a heavily armed fleet with building materials to this trading post of São Jorge de Mina to construct a fortress. On 10 caravels and 2 transport ships, foundation stones, roof tiles, nails, provisions, all were sent. And the structure that was constructed was one of the first European buildings constructed in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, many men were sent on these 12 ships to help with the construction and to deal with any business matters. And Columbus was on one of these 12 ships, now 30 years old. When he arrives in El Mina, Columbus brings together 3 pieces of very crucial information that concretize the idea that he had been thinking about for quite a while now, the idea of a Western route to Asia. In West Africa, he found seemingly endless supplies of precious gold, the Gold Coast. Contemporary understandings of geography taught Columbus that regions at the same latitude enjoyed similar climates and natural features. So in his understanding, if he was to head directly due west from Elmina, he would find lands rich in gold. Gold was important to him to help to build the army that he needed for the reconquest of Jerusalem. The second piece of information that Columbus learned in Elmina was that Asia was close. Sailors in the African city told him that logs regularly washed up on shore that seemed to have been worked by human hands, evidence that the lands across the ocean from whence this worked wood supposedly came could not have been very far away at all. The third piece of information that he learned in Elmina had to do with the Atlantic's currents and wind patterns. The prevailing current off the West African coast flows out to sea, which is the exact opposite of the situation in Portugal, where the eastward currents made it difficult to sail west for most of the year. So to head west from Iberia then, it made sense to first sail south along the African coast to pick up the westerly current across the ocean. From Elmina, Columbus returned to Iberia, confident that he understood now how to execute his plan to sail across the ocean to find Asia, the Grand Khan, to surround the Muslims of the Middle East, and eventually to conquer Jerusalem. The thing that he most needed at this point was a patron. The story of Columbus's back and forth negotiations between various European sovereigns to secure patronage is a very, very famous one that I won't get into now. What I want to emphasize, though, and what has not been remarked upon is the role that the Ottomans and other Muslims played in this affair of seeking patronage. Columbus's major push for the money that he needed for his voyages occurred during the late 1480s. This was the same decade in which the eventual financiers of his voyages, the second cousins Isabella and Ferdinand, had declared their war against Islam in Iberia. And it's not a coincidence that Europe's war on Islam in Iberia and elsewhere and Columbus's voyages occurred at almost exactly the same time. In Columbus's mind, in the mind of the Spanish sovereigns, these were two pieces of what they interpreted as a millennial war between Christianity and Islam. As part of a global strategy against Islam, the Spanish moved their navies east in the Mediterranean against the Ottomans and other Muslim powers, endeavored to push out all of Iberia's Muslims, and sent Columbus off to the west to try to surround the Muslims of the Middle East. Ottoman advances in the second half of the 15th century directly impacted Spanish holdings in the Mediterranean. Mehmed the Conqueror of Constantinople, captured the strategic walled port city of Otranto on the very tip of the heel of the Italian peninsula, right here, Otranto. He captured this small port in 1480. From there, he sent ships to the coast of Sicily to assess a potential invasion of that island. Sicily is the largest of the Mediterranean's island, once a Muslim possession, of course, but in the 15th century was under the nominal sovereignty of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And so a threatening move by the Ottomans demanded the Spanish king and queen's attention. Ottoman rule over a place like Sicily would have solidified their control of the entire eastern half of the Mediterranean. Again, think of Genoa being pushed out of the Black Sea, being steadily pushed out of the Aegean, and now the Ottomans pushing even further west, potentially all the way to Sicily. Were the Ottomans to hold Sicily, this would give them a launching pad for invasions further west in the sea. Sicily is very much the midway point of the sea, and was of much concern of the Ottoman of the Spanish sovereigns. So much so that one of Isabella's court chroniclers wrote, quote, "Every day news came to the king and queen that the Turks had a great armada on the sea and that they were sending it to conquer the kingdom of Sicily." The Spanish sovereigns leapt into action, sending a fleet to defend Sicily. Luckily for them, though, Mehmet died the next year in 1481, and the Ottoman succession crisis forced the empire to give up on Sicily, to give up Otranto, and indeed to withdraw from Italy altogether, and they would never gain any other territory on the Italian peninsula after that. Despite this retreat, though, over the course of the 1480s, the Ottomans continued to push west in the Mediterranean, testing Spain's resolve and the resolve of other European powers. In 1488, Mehmet's son and successor, Bayezid, attacked Malta. This prompted Spain again to send reinforcements to strengthen its garrisons in Sicily. Again, Malta very close to Sicily, as you see here. Between 1487 and the middle of the 1490s, Ottoman ships made landings even further west, reaching all the way to Corsica, Pisa, the Balearic Islands, and North African ports just across from the Iberian mainland itself. These were not full-scale military invasions, did not result in any sort of lasting Ottoman settlements, but nevertheless, the sight of Ottoman ships forcibly pulling into harbor panicked already frightened European states. The force of the Ottomans seemed to be all over the sea. These gains in the Mediterranean against Spain and other European interests made the already precarious position of Spain's Muslims much more dire. These internal Muslims in Iberia were lumped together with Spain's external Muslim enemies. Like Columbus, Henry, the Pope, Isabella considered it her duty to crusade against Muslims wherever they may be. Within Iberia, there were Muslims both living under Spanish Christian rule and small Muslim states in the south, independent states in the south. Both were liable allies of the Ottomans and other Muslims, according to Isabella and Ferdinand. So given the Ottomans' territorial expansion in the 1480s, Isabella and Ferdinand saw their Reconquista in the south, their war against the Muslims in the south, not simply as a process of local political consolidation on the Iberian Peninsula, but rather as one piece of what they saw as a global civilizational war, interpreted by them and by other Christians as the first step in rolling back Islam and its representative states from the Mediterranean, and if they had their way, eventually from the face of the earth altogether. Steeped his entire life in the rhetoric and reality of the Crusades, Columbus used his belief in the notion of a war between Christendom and Islam to push his case for the Atlantic voyages with Isabella and Ferdinand. If he could show them that heading west across the ocean would help to defeat Islam, then he thought they might be more liable to finance his journey. Columbus found it very difficult to get any traction with the sovereigns in this period. They were really too busy with their wars to pay him any attention. In the late 1480s, Ferdinand and Isabella were fighting in the south, and the Reconquista was quite successful in these years. The famous surrender of Granada, of course, on January 2nd, 1492, legally ended over 7 centuries of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. For Christians everywhere, not just in Spain, Granada represented a monumental victory over Islam. Church bells rang out across European cities. The Pope ordered a day of festivities. Celebratory bullfights were organized across Spain. Mock reenactments of the siege of Granada were played out across European towns. Coming just a few decades after the loss of Constantinople, Granada was for many in Europe an act of retribution, a Christian answer to the most powerful Muslim empire on earth. In the words of one Spanish court historian, the conquest of Granada, quote, was famed and celebrated through all the realms of Christendom, and it extended to the farthest and most remote lands of the Turk and the Sultan. After the fall of Granada in January 1492, Isabella, against the judgment of her advisors and her husband, emboldened by her recent victories, agreed to fund Columbus's journey across the Atlantic. She had just vanquished Spain's Muslim kingdoms, a first step, she thought, in her global war against Christianity's ultimate enemy. Christ would march upon the world. Jerusalem would be won. If Columbus's plan, risky and far-fetched as it was, could contribute in even a minor way to the destruction of Islam, then it would have proved more than a worthy investment of the Queen's resources. The opening lines of Columbus's logbook on his first foray across the Atlantic make plain that he understood his voyage as a new crusade in centuries of war between Islam and Christendom. In the space of just a single sentence, Columbus pivoted from Spain's Reconquista to finding and converting the Grand Khan Marco Polo had promised, and to surrounding, therefore, Islam. The extension of Spain's civilizational religious crusade is part of what sent Columbus off across the Atlantic. And this is essential to understanding his voyages. He sailed off to win Jerusalem. To win Jerusalem for Christendom. And this is why the story that I've relayed to you of the biography of Columbus's interactions with Islam matters so much. From his earliest days in Genoa, where he waved good tidings to crusaders, to his experience with the Portuguese enslavement of Muslims and others in West Africa, to the very moment before he left Europe in Granada, Columbus's life was formed in and against Islam. So this brings us then to that fateful moment, to 1492, that freighted tipping point of multi-continental destruction and transformation. It also brings me to stop sharing my screen, which I'll do now. What does the history I've just relayed of Columbus and Islam mean for our understanding of this fateful year? When turning to the writings of Columbus and others in that first generation of conquistadors, one finds, perhaps surprisingly, sparks of Islam flying up from their pages. In the Americas, where Islam so very clearly did not exist, they nevertheless saw it. As arresting as it may seem, the Spanish stretched the analytical limits of their late 15th century universe to understand some of the Americas and its indigenous peoples as somehow related to Islam. What do I mean by this? Let me give some examples. In his journals, Columbus refers to the weapons of the indigenous Tainos in the Caribbean as alfanjes, a Spanish word derived from the Arabic for a curved metal sword inscribed with Quranic verses that was commonly used by Muslim soldiers in battle in Spain. Despite the fact that Columbus himself tells us that the Taino, quote, have no iron, and of course, they knew nothing of the Quran, he likens them to Muslim soldiers by putting these swords in their hands. Later, when Columbus first saw the scarves of a group of Taino women, he thought they were somehow related through trade or some other form of Eurasian contact to what he termed Moorish sashes. A friar named Ramon Pane, who sailed on Columbus's second voyage in 1494, described Indian singing as akin to that of the Moors. A couple decades later, Cortez wrote that the Aztecs of Mexico, quote, wore Moorish robes, that Aztec women, quote, looked like Moorish women. Aztec dancing, he thought, was derived from the dances of the Moors. Cortez's encounter with the Aztecs proved especially fertile for these kinds of comparisons between the Islamic civilizations the Spanish had fought in the Old World and what they were experiencing in the New World. In the Aztecs, Cortez and his men met a formidable, complex empire with enormous cities, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, a highly sophisticated political culture, and imposing armies. More than, for example, Taino society, the Spanish saw in the Aztecs a rival enemy civilization akin to their enemies of the Old World, the Muslim empires of the Mediterranean. Cortez wrote, for example, that he saw over 400 mosques, mezquitas, in what is today Mexico. He called Montezuma a sultan. He described Montezuma's palaces in terms strikingly similar to those of the Muslim palaces of Granada, including claiming to see in Mexico tiles and roofing that only existed in Granada at the time. These things continued long after Columbus and Cortez. Over the course of the 16th century, the Spanish, for example, would try to subdue and convert the nomadic Chichimecas of Mexico, referring to them as El Arabes, the Arabs. In Brazil, the children of Portuguese men and Indian women were referred to as El Mamelucos, the Mamluks, the Mamluk Empire based in Cairo. Plains Indians captured and transported by the Spanish as slaves to what is today New Mexico came to be known as Janisarios, a corruption of the Turkish word for the Janissaries, Yenicheri. The Spanish named a large city in the Yucatan Grand Cairo. We could go on and on citing these kinds of examples. The city on the US-Mexico border today that's in the news because of the migrant crisis is another example of this, Matamoros, Moor Slayer, the slayer of the Moors. At one level, there's nothing surprising about any of this. The Spanish conquistadors were forged in an old world crucible of Christian-Muslim violence. Many of them had fought against the Muslim kingdoms of southern Iberia and North Africa. Many had encountered Muslims in West Africa as well. Many had traded with Muslim traders in ports around the Mediterranean. Grasping for some conceptual framework through which to reconcile all of the difference and the newness they encountered in the Americas, they turned to the most extreme version of otherness available to them, Islam. In a new place, fighting new enemies, they fell back on what they knew, as we always do. As John Eliot, one of the foremost historians of Cortez, notes, quote, since the only political model for his conquest Cortez knew was the reconquest, the Reconquista, Montezuma had to be treated in his narrative as a Muslim ruler would have been. Anahuac in central Mexico is thus described, as far as Cortez is able, in images more appropriate to Assyria or Persia than to any possible American Indian society, unquote. At another level, though, the sparks of Islam in the historical record of the early Spanish colonial Caribbean offer us numerous ways of conceiving of the place of Islam in the early modern world and allow us to see the history of the Americas in a new way. And these are going to be my closing thoughts on these 2 points. Columbus's biography with Islam helps us to see that 1492 was not the break it's often portrayed to be. 1492, the beginning of the modern world. 1492, the end of the independent sovereignty of the Americas. To properly and fully understand 1492, we must understand the continuities that made and shaped it. Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic were a direct result of one particular continuity, that of Muslim-Christian animosity in the Mediterranean. The crucible of the Crusades, centuries of warfare, and the increasing encroachment of the Ottomans west in the years after 1453 forged in the minds of Columbus, Cortez, and thousands of other Europeans that their enemies were Muslims, that the notion of enemy to them had something to do with Islam. They took this long history of warring with them across the Atlantic. Indeed, many of those who ended up fighting the American Indians in the New World had fought Muslims in the Old World. Some of them would even come back from the Americas to fight again against their Muslim enemies of old. Cortez, for example, waged the last war of his life in Algiers in 1541 after his exploits in Mexico. As one of the earliest 16th century Spanish historians of the Americas wrote, quote, "The conquest of the Indians began after that of the Moors was completed, so that the Spaniards would ever fight the infidels." Islam had pushed Europe's crusades to the Caribbean, where even on the other side of the Atlantic, Europeans still often conceived of their enemies as somehow being related to Muslims. In narratives of 1492 as break, Islam is always portrayed as being of the old world, part of all that was left behind for a new European beginning in a new world. It is precisely because Islam was so central to the history of Europe in the old world that it had to be excised from the histories of Europe in the new world. Historians have in many ways followed the lead of many of these early Europeans who went to the Americas, those who sought to relegate Islam to the past in favor of a future free of this old world menace. Indeed, beginning just a few decades after Columbus and continuing for centuries after that, Europeans feared the transfer of Islam to the Americas. Trying to keep Islam out of the New World meant also trying to keep it out of many of the narratives of the making of the modern world after 1492. If the Atlantic voyages are so crucial to the history of the world after the year 1500, I think it's hard to argue that they're not important. And if Islam is removed from this story, then Islam is never foundational, additive, or even relevant to this modern history. It stands apart, only appearing every now and then as a violent enemy on the margins. Leaving out the story of Islam in the shaping of Columbus thus removes it from the early history of the colonization of the Americas. It prevents us from seeing the integral role Islam played in forming the violent early years of Spanish rule in the New World. However, if we accept that Islam is part of one of the oldest cultural tropes in the New World, as long as the history of European colonialism and disease in the Americas, if we accept that Islam was the mold that cast the history of European racial and ethnic thinking in the Americas, as well as the history of warfare in the Western Hemisphere, then we must admit that Islam has to be a part of any understanding of the history of the Americas from the very beginning. The idea of Islam as a deep existential threat was there at the beginning of Europeans stepping foot on these continents. The history of this idea in the Western Hemisphere is older than, say, Protestantism or any British or French interests in the Americas. It's older than the transatlantic slave trade. It's older than any nation state in the Americas. It runs through all of these histories, though, and so beginning a history of the Americas here tells very different stories than those we're used to. Indeed, we might go so far as to say that the two origins of European colonization in the Americas were its crusading ethos of the kind that I've described today, and of course, the deadly confrontations with Native Americans. And these are linked stories, as I've tried to suggest today. Telling them together allows us to uncover a durable conceptual link in the European turned American psyche between violence against Native Americans and Muslims. If the original language of European warfare in this hemisphere derived from Europe's wars with Islam, from at least the 18th century, that language was formed by America's warfare against Native peoples. This is a historical reversal of profound importance that suggests that we should spend more time recognizing and thinking about the history of these seemingly disparate yet bound cultures. Moreover, given that since Vietnam, the primary theater of American war has been in the Muslim world, with the attendant consequences for Muslim Americans, it bears thinking deeply about this long intertwined history of warfare, animosity, and vilification. So this is admittedly a very long way from where we've been. I raise it though because some of the strands of our present were spun by the story of Columbus and Islam that I presented today. It's an obvious starting point for the history of how European colonialism affected the Americas. And I've tried to suggest that it's also a starting point for thinking about how native peoples have been folded into a long history of European Islamic relations. And this is a history I think we need to assimilate better. Doing so would help to contribute to the manifold efforts to understand histories of European native encounters and the histories of European polities in the Americas, and then eventually the United States itself in a far more global scope. So I will end there. Thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan, for that wonderful talk and contextualization. I think there are lots of questions that we are getting on the chat, but I'm burning to ask this question, which is, where does the Jewish expulsion and where do the Jewish peoples come in this mix of this encounter? Do you see them somehow as being apart or embroiled in this? And also what I'm really curious is, when I want to feel optimistic, it's hard at the current moment, given the global alignment and these sort of animosities, persistent animosities. I love how you've connected the dots and shown that the sort of animosity towards others has a very long history and a very deep history. So I was curious, if you think about Al-Andalus, right, there was this moment, golden moment, when these multiple cultures thrived. So what do you think was key for that kind of thriving of these multiple religious traditions and cultures?
Thank you for that. Yes, so I didn't have time to go into the history of the Jews of Spain. Is a really important and integral part to this story. I can answer it in a couple of ways. So one is, the major events of 1492 related to Iberia are the Reconquista, Columbus's voyages, and the expulsion of the Jews. I talked about two of them. There's an Ottoman part to that story, which is that most of Iberia's Jews eventually end up in, or more than any other single place, most of them end up in the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, this is after some time in Portugal or in North Africa or in various parts of the Mediterranean, but many eventually make their way to the Ottoman Empire, and famously the city of Salonika, Thessaloniki in today's Greece, becomes the largest Jewish city in the world, and at various points has a Jewish majority. So the first Jewish majority city since antiquity.
Many did go to Italy as well, right?
Yes. There are waves of embarkations and expulsions. So sometimes people settle in various places and then and stay. Some people settle for a little while and then move on. It's a very complicated history, obviously. But in broad brushstrokes, that's part of the story that I tell in my book, and that's part of the story here. There is and of course, obviously, anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism is rampant in Spain. Before this period, very famously, there are instances of waves of anti-Jewish violence for centuries, but increasingly up to 1492. The sort of Catholic animosity towards Jews and Muslims is quite different in its nature. In the case of Muslims, it is more geopolitical and existential. In the case of Jews, it's more theological and at the level of notions of cleanliness, disease, contagion in cities, right? And you know, as I think you were suggesting, I mean, linking others to disease is something that happens in Spain in this period, as it is happening today. But it's because there's no equivalent of a Jewish Ottoman Empire. There is no external Jewish state that is a potential geopolitical rival of a Catholic state. And so that makes the position of, and there are other reasons obviously, of Jews and Muslims very different in Spain. So this notion that the Muslims of Spain are a liable fifth column for any Muslim polity, whether it be the Ottomans, the Mamluks, etc., is one that doesn't exist for Jews. And so that gives a very different positionality of those communities within Spain.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think I'll handle a couple of the questions, and Ty, then you can take over.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, so there's a question from Carlton Tucker. Besides Marco Polo's writings and Crusades oral stories, would Columbus have possibly heard of the stories of Ibn Batuta? Some have called the Muslim, referred to him as the Muslim Columbus, a century earlier.
Yeah, well, the Muslim Marco Polo, not the Muslim Columbus, but I've seen no evidence that Columbus knew of Ibn Batuta's writings. We know that he read various other tales. For example, the legend of the seven cities of Cibola was very important for Columbus, which is a story about, see if I get this right, a group of bishops who flee Spain with Muslim ships that have a lot of gold. They settle on these mythic islands somewhere in the sea. And so, you know, various explorers tried to find these islands and the gold that they possessed, again, to fund a crusade or for any other purpose. But I don't think Columbus knew of Ibn Batuta.
Ty, did you want to?
Yes, sure. Another question submitted from a participant. A few years later, Vasco da Gama is said to have been guided from the east coast of Africa to India by Arab sailors. He found Arab merchants in India when he landed. How did he negotiate his relationship with these Moors in contrast to Columbus?
That's a good question that I don't think I have a full answer to, other than to say, you know, Vasco da Gama shared in a language of crusade as much as any of these other explorers. He doesn't, but that's what I would answer to that question. I mean, you know, Columbus also uses various Arab sailing technologies during his voyages. There's a complicated story about the kind of sail that is used on the ships that he takes across the Atlantic that combined the technology of the dhow, which is an Indian Ocean vessel that Vasco da Gama used. But you know, in a general way, Vasco da Gama is steeped in this same rhetoric, language, and education of crusade, and is seeking a way around the Muslim empires of the Middle East as much as any of these others are.
There is a question regarding Columbus's reasoning. Doesn't the prevailing current contradict the idea of wood detritus floating east to West Africa?
Okay, I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question?
So the question is, doesn't the prevailing current contradict the idea of wood detritus floating from east to West Africa? Oh,
right. I see what you're saying. I guess it does. But I think the question points to the fact that notion of wood floating from across the ocean from Asia is wrong. that wood was probably coming from the port itself or from somewhere further south on the coast or something like that. Or maybe wasn't even worked by human hands at all, but when they looked at it, they thought it was. Who knows?
Right. So then there's a question that is a bit tricky to parse, but let me try. So how would you describe your positionality or your lens in this research or book? I don't know how they want you to frame your political position, your epistemic position.
I can answer that question. I'm happy to answer that question. So I would say in this talk, I really turned up the volume on an idea of civilizational conflict. One that historians have generally been trying to get away from. And I admit that I wrestled with that. And I'll tell you a little bit about why I decided to keep that language. One is that's the language of the sources. The sources, the Christian sources, and the Muslim sources, but focusing here on Columbus and his writings and those of others, they use this language of civilizational conflict, of millennial confrontation with Islam. Columbus spends the last few years of his life writing a kind of compendia of ideas about the end times, right? He very much is steeped in this set of ideas around conquest, warfare, existential crisis of Christianity. So that's I'm being true to the sources. The other sort of historiographical, I want to say move, but challenge that I'm putting forth is the following. So, historians of the Mediterranean and of other cross-cultural zones, if you like, but the Mediterranean is the place where a lot of this work happens, have over the past few decades done a lot of really important work showing how confessional boundaries might not have been as fixed as we think, linguistic boundaries, Italian traders were living and marrying often in the Ottoman world. Muslims were in Europe. There's this sense of back and forth, almost a kind of happy-go-lucky trading identities, religions, intermarriage, language, etc. And that is obviously true to a point. I think we've overemphasized the idea that, and there are all kinds of explanations for why we've done this, but we've overemphasized the idea that something like religion might not matter as much as we think it does. I think religion does matter quite a lot to these people in very stark and important ways, geopolitically, theologically, existentially. And so I want to sort of reinsert that into the discussion here. Historians have, and I've taught this work in my courses, have to great effect used the records of the Inquisition. Obviously a endeavor of religious violence to narrate other kinds of histories, right? Of commerce, of gender relations, all kinds of things. And that's very, very useful again. But I think we have to understand the confessional structure in which much of this is taking place. And Columbus's relationship with the Muslim world is one of the ways of doing that. But it does mean that, in some ways for provocative purposes, that I've turned up the volume more on the violent confrontation, warfare, civilizational crisis.
Yeah, but I'm curious because so that's very interesting. But that reframing of the modern conflict is not particularly productive, right? So there's Ferguson and these other people who are framing the current situation as a clash of civilization.
Sure.
Do you believe that is actually productive for the modern kind of mirroring today's struggle?
Yeah. No. I mean, and that's why we as historians have tended to move away from that.
Right.
Nevertheless, though, I would push back a little bit to say, not to you, but to that work, to say that when you look at the history of Christianity, there is an anti-Islamic thread that runs through much of it.
Right.
and it's pretty consistent. Oh, let's say, we can argue about when, and
it runs deep. You're right. It runs very deep, right?
And it ebbs and flows over time, etc. And I think we need to wrestle with that and take that seriously and understand why that can. Look, there's been a lot of work done on anti-Semitism, the long history of anti-Semitism from antiquity, even before Christianity, right? From antiquity to the present. There's a whole set of books. There's been some on, an equivalent sort of story about Islam in Christian thought. But I think there's a lot more work that could be done there. So, yes, I wrestled with not wanting to tell the kind of clash of civilization stories that Muslims and Christians have been fighting for all time, everywhere, always. And yet, pretty consistently, at least from the period that I know best, right, the kind of late medieval to the present, if you look at various periods of Christian writing and thought, I'm talking about European Christianity here, you do see that there is a pretty consistent trend of anti-Muslim sentiment, writing about the theological bankruptcy of Islam, talking about the political corruption of Islam, etc. Yeah. So that story needs to be told. I'm not doing that here, but that balance has to be kept in play, of not doing the crude version of Clash of Civilizations, but nevertheless seeing that there is a story here.
Right. So the next question is from a member of the audience. What I heard of Muslim influence on Columbus is that Muslim sources had the best figure for the circumference of the earth to find the Qibla, but they were expressed in Arab miles rather than the shorter Roman mile used in Europe. Columbus used good figures, but with the wrong interpretation to argue that the voyage was shorter.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't gone deep on that line on Columbus. Look, when you get into the Columbus scholarship, it goes in all kinds of directions.
Right. I mean, there's also issues of maps. I remember reading that there were incorrect maps. So then the follow-up question is, Genoa had colonies in the Crimea, as you pointed out. Mm-hmm. So I'm surprised that there was such inaccurate information on the Mongols. There was no great Khan by then.
Well, so the idea of the great Khan, many historians think, is based in some fact. Mm-hmm. That being the Nestorian Christians of Western China. Mm-hmm. So there is evidence that during the Yuan period, that there were people who converted to Christianity, and that might have been one of the reference for the idea of the great Khan having an interest in Christianity.
So there's an interesting question. Is there evidence that when Cortez and others went back from the Americas, that they took with them some of the people they had conquered? And if so, were these individuals distributed by them in North Africa or in Europe?
You mean native peoples?
Yeah, native peoples. Yeah.
Yeah. No, native peoples go back with Columbus, and on after that, that's a quite common thing for on various European expeditions for native peoples to go back to Europe, not back, but go to Europe, and then sometimes back to the Americas, but sometimes not also.
Great. Hi, do you see any further questions?
No, I don't. I think we got them all.
We got them all?
Yeah, can I just follow up my question, the Cortez question?
Sure.
About the native people. So were those people forced to assimilate into Christianity or Islam, or?
Well, it depends who we're talking about, because
since you mentioned that they were perceived as Muslim.
Right. No. I mean, so usually when native peoples are brought to Europe, they are sort of displayed as spectacles to be seen in cities.
Yeah.
And any kind of religious conversion that they would have experienced or had forced upon them was to Christianity, not to Islam.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you so much, Alan, for this wonderful talk and answering the vigorous Q&A. And thanks everyone for attending, and look forward to seeing you all at the next Frankie event.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.